Today's guest is an author whose recent book has been one of the most anticipated by the New York Times. Gina Chung's debut novel, Sea Change, explores love, loss, heartbreak, and so much more. Gina's taking us inside the unique book. This is Advocate Now. Well, Gina, congrats on the recent release of your debut novel, Sea Change. It was a New York Times most anticipated book. Tell me about it.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. So Sea Change is a story about love, loss, and cephalopods. It's kind of a breakup story. We learn from the beginning of the book that my protagonist, Ro, who's a 30-year-old Korean-American aquarium worker, has just been broken up with, and her boyfriend, Tae, is not just leaving her, he's leaving the planet to join a privately funded mission to colonize Mars. And the story is kind of set in a near future where I like to say it's about like 5 minutes or so in the future where the climate crisis is ever more urgent. And so Ro's boyfriend is sort of joining this sort of last ditch mission to address the climate crisis by visiting a new planet. And so she's kind of left in the wake of all of this. And she's also dealing with a lot of loss and change in her personal life. She has a bit of a strained relationship with her mother. And about 15 years ago, her father, who also worked at the aquarium where she now works and was a marine biologist, disappeared at sea during what was supposed to be a routine research expedition. And with her best friend Yoonhee pulling away to focus on her upcoming wedding, Ro is kind of left to her own devices. But the one sort of bright spot in her life is Dolores, who is a giant Pacific octopus at the aquarium where she works. And she also happens to be her last point of connection with her father, who discovered her at sea. And sort of the inciting incident of the book is that she learns that Dolores is going to be sold to a private investor. And so she really has to kind of come to terms with her childhood trauma and the losses she's endured and find her place in an ever-changing world.
You mentioned the character Dolores, which is a Pacific octopus. I mean, how did that idea come about and how much research did you have to do on the subject?
Yeah, so I really actually kind of started with the image of Dolores, the octopus. So she changes colors, which is a thing that octopuses can actually do. But she's sort of even more fantastical and kind of larger than life, larger than your average giant Pacific octopus. And so I started writing this book with just the first line of the book, which is "This morning, Dolores was blue." And it came out of a writing prompt that I was assigned in a class that I was taking in my MFA program. And I love to write about animals in the natural world. I find it really grounding and inspiring as a writer. And so I kind of thought to myself, you know, who is Dolores? Why is she turning blue? And just kind of decided she was an octopus. And then from there, the voice of the character, Ro, came to life for me, as did the world of the aquarium. And I wrote this book, the majority of the book, during fall and winter 2020, during those dark pre-vaccine days of the pandemic, when we weren't going anywhere or doing anything. And I kind of wrote it in a sprint in about 3 months, which I don't think would have happened had it not been for those external circumstances. But because we couldn't really go anywhere, I was, dying to go to an aquarium to do research. But instead, I ended up just doing a lot of research on YouTube and kind of reading everything I could out there online about giant Pacific octopuses and doing research on sort of how they move, how they interact with the people that care for them if they're in captivity. And so it just taught me a lot about, the day-to-day life of an aquarium worker and also what goes into taking care of these really magnificent and complex creatures.
And the novel really explores loss, heartbreak, grief, and trauma. Why did you first decide to make those themes central to your first novel?
That's a great question. I think those are themes that just kind of preoccupy me in general as a writer. And I wanted to explore those themes from sort of an unexpected place, which I think is why I decided to set it in sort of a near future kind of speculative world and through the lens of this person who has a somewhat unique job in taking care of this giant Pacific octopus. I think I was also in a time in my personal life when, we were all kind of going through it back then. And I was also going through a breakup of my own and sort of navigating a lot of changes in my relationships. And I think during that time also, many of us were just figuring out, what we really wanted in the world and what our relationships would look like after all of this. And so I think a lot of that ended up in the novel without my even realizing it at the time. And I also really wanted to explore the point of view of a Korean American woman who is from a family of immigrants. And while she herself is not an immigrant, she grows up with this impact of the big changes and the journey that her family has had to endure in order to find their place in this country. And so I think a lot of those themes are pretty present in a lot of my work. And it just so happened that they took the form of, the sort of focus of being around this octopus relationship.
And you grew up in what you called a fairly white town in New Jersey. As you mentioned, Sea Change does have a large range of Korean characters. Was that inspired by your childhood or even a way of exploring and rewriting what your experience might have looked like had you grown up in an all Korean American setting?
Definitely. Yeah. And so I grew up in, as you mentioned, a pretty white town in what is otherwise a rather diverse county of northern New Jersey. And so it felt like when I was growing up, I was sort of navigating these two very different worlds, one of which was the world of school and my day-to-day, where my family was one of two Asian American families in the whole town. Whereas on the weekends, my family was and still is a very church-going family. And so when we went to church, we went to a pretty large Korean American church. And so it felt like, on the weekends when we were part of that community, and also going to restaurants and businesses and going to grocery stores, like there was this whole other Korean/Korean American world and community that was actually fairly close knit. Whereas in my day to day, it felt like, when I was growing up, people hadn't even heard of Korea. Many of my classmates were just completely unfamiliar with the context of it outside of like the Korean War, if they'd even heard of that at that early age. So it came out of a lot of feelings of the loneliness that I was experiencing at the time, and the feeling of not that there weren't people who looked and felt like me, but that I just didn't see my experience really reflected in any of the books that I was reading at the time as a child.
And representation in the arts is so important. It is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Are there any Asian American writers who you looked to for inspiration while growing up?
Definitely. I think, she's just sort of one of the great classics of Asian American literature is The Joy Luck Club, of course, by Amy Tan. And my mom gave me my first copy of that book. And, she sort of jokingly was kind of like, maybe one day you'll be the Korean American Amy Tan. And I just remember thinking that, wow, I didn't even know that, people like me, although she's obviously Chinese American, like I just found it so inspiring to read that book. And the locus of that book being mother-daughter relationships was really inspiring to me as well. And also Maxine Hong Kingston, the first time I ever read her in the context of a class I was taking in school, it just blew my mind that, you could write about memories and stories passed down from family through the lens of fiction, such an inventive and startling way. And so those are two definitely huge inspirational influences on my life growing up.
And you have a collection of short stories titled Green Frog that'll be out in 2024. What can we expect? And in terms of themes, how will that differ from Sea Change?
I think a lot of the themes are somewhat similar in that it covers themes of Korean American girlhood and womanhood, bodies, animals, transformation. But with short stories, I often feel I can be a little bit more experimental. And so there are definitely some short stories in there that are a little bit even more speculative and almost sort of on the sci-fi end of things. And there's sort of a wide cast of characters in that collection. And there's a story told from the point of view of a praying mantis, from the point of view of a magical kumiho, which is a Korean archetype where it's a woman who can appear as a fox or vice versa. And so there's a lot of kind of more magic and transformation and speculative themes in that collection.
And you were a recipient of the highly revered Pushcart Prize. Looking back on your childhood, did you always envision that you'd become an author?
I think it was a long-held childhood dream of mine, for sure. It was one of the first things that I remember thinking I wanted to be, once I sort of grew past the childhood dreams of like wanting to be a princess or, president of the United States. And so, yeah, I think it took me a while, however, to realize that dream, in that I always felt a sort of pressure to kind of focus on something that was a little bit more practical than writing, so to speak. And so I worked in a lot of fields that were adjacent to writing, such as I worked in book publishing for a time. I work and still work at a literary nonprofit that supports writers. But it wasn't until I was at a point in my later 20s when I decided to take the plunge to apply for MFA programs and really focus on my writing that I started to admit to myself, like, okay, maybe it's time to revisit this dream.
Well, congratulations on your success. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We look forward to your new work that will be coming out.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I'm Sonia Baghdadi. Thanks for watching and advocating. For more stories and content like this, visit advocate.com and advocatechannel.com.